Professor Hough, thank you so much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. How do you assess the far-right AfD's performance in the German elections, where the party nearly doubled its vote share compared to 2021 elections? What factors do you think contributed most to this surge?
Well, I thought it was expected, their performance. I was expecting around 20%, and that's what they got. So in the end, the result was not a surprise. We've known for a few years that the AfD was going to do well, and they did. The only question was around the detail. Would they get more or less than 20%? And you know, how they would then choose to sell that. In truth, the more pressing issue for German politics was the performance of the smaller parties, because whether they got into parliament was going to have a much larger impact on the government. And of course, the German government, like many other governments around the world, has big challenges to face. So it was important that Germany has a functioning government moving forward, and the AfD has no real role to play in that. So the focus for me actually was not so much on the AfD; it was much more on the smaller parties and the 5% hurdle.
Right. Do you believe the endorsements of AfD by Elon Musk and US Vice President J.D. Vance had any measurable impact on the election results, or were their influences more symbolic than substantive?
Well, I'm not sure their influences with that. We don't know. We haven't had a look at the data in great detail, but the AfD's performance was exactly as we expected, even before Donald Trump won the election and before Elon Musk took on whatever role he now officially thinks he takes in American politics. So there's no real evidence they had any influence. They were certainly noted, but they were very much welcomed by the hardcore of AfD supporters. But in terms of influencing things, I'd like to see any evidence that showed they had any influence at all, really.
Right. You have argued that immigration and refugee policy has become a key battleground for European center-right parties as they compete with center-left and liberal parties. Given that immigration is also a central theme for far-right parties, to what extent do center-right parties risk legitimizing the far-right by adopting similar rhetoric and policy positions?
Well, the challenge that the mainstream democratic parties have is that there is not an easy answer to questions of who should be allowed to come into a country, under what circumstances, and how they should be treated. I mean, it would be nice if there were, but a country like Germany, which has land borders with 9 other states, which has had a couple of million refugees come into Germany in the last 10 years, will always have challenges in integrating and processing newcomers to the state. So there isn't a right answer for the CDU to come up with here. Whatever they do, there's going to be quite a lot of people who are unhappy with it, whether you're on the left and you're arguing for a more liberal stance on these issues, or whether you're on the right and you're arguing for a more restrictive one. What we do know is that ignoring the AfD has not done any good whatsoever. The AfD has risen to 20%. However, engaging with the AfD, if you follow what's happened in Austria, where the Freedom Party has been heavily engaged by the centre-right at various times over the last 20 years, has also not done any good. The Freedom Party get more votes than the AfD does. So what do we do? You know, you can either engage and the AfD gets stronger. You can not engage with these issues and the AfD gets stronger. So somewhere in the middle, there has to be, you'd think, another option or another set of options. And Merz is treading a path where he doesn't want to talk to the AfD, but he does want to engage with potential AfD voters. Now, I'm not sure if I was a political strategist that I would necessarily recommend that he did that, but I understand why he's trying to take the sting out of the migration issue, because we know that when Germans worry less about migration, they're going to vote less for the AfD. Okay, so that we know that this issue has to have a policy response that makes sense, and that Germans can see making sense on the ground, because it is a salient issue of the day. That's the challenge, coming up with answers that actually help process the problem, process the challenge. The other thing with the AfD is that although migration is a key driver of their support, a lot of it is also about dissatisfaction, particularly in Eastern Germany, dissatisfaction with the multiple crises that these people have gone through over the last 30 years since the collapse of the GDR. So migration is one issue, and it's a salient issue, but the deeper wells of dissatisfaction are also really big issues, and that they're broader than just the focus on, you know, who should come to Germany and under what circumstances.
Right. The AfD has positioned itself as an anti-elite, anti-corruption party while being embroiled in its own corruption controversies. How does this contradiction affect voter perceptions? How do you explain the relationship between corruption and the rise of far-right movements? What does the German case and German elections on Sunday tell us about this relationship?
Well, you're assuming that people are logical and people are rational, and that if something happens, they'll respond in a logical manner. And again, there are plenty of lessons from Austria, a country which is arguably a couple of decades further along than Germany in terms of dealing with a populist party. And we know that some of the scandals that the Freedom Party has got involved in are truly ridiculous. You know, the Ibiza scandal is one that folks might want to tune into, a truly crazy scandal, but it didn't really affect the Freedom Party in Austria at all, because the drivers of AfD support are general dissatisfaction. Their dissatisfaction with the government has been really unimpressive. Their dissatisfaction with policies that they see not working. So the AfD is like a vector of their unhappiness. And for as long as that exists, then the AfD is going to be able to get away with much more than people in polite society might imagine it would. It's not dissimilar to with Trump. Trump says some truly, you know, remarkable is a nice way of describing it, truly remarkable things, but they're factored in now. People have got used to it. And he can say ever more crazy things, and people just don't change their opinions of him, whether they like him or whether they loathe him. And the AfD is in a not dissimilar position. You know, it's factored in that things will not always be logical with them, but they still represent, for enough people, an actor that they can support to give the mainstream elites a bit of a slap round the face.
Right. You have written extensively on the role of citizens in anti-corruption efforts. How does corruption, whether real or perceived, fuel support for populist movements, particularly in Europe? How do populist parties like AfD exploit corruption grievances to mobilize support?
Yeah, and there's a lot to be said there. Populist parties, of course, like having a dichotomy. They like talking about the elites. The elites look after themselves. They don't look after you, the people. They like this divide. They have a real disdain for process, for politics being difficult, about compromise, about bargains and about deals. They're not really interested in that. There's the good guys here, that's the people, and there's the bad guys up there, that's the elites. Now that fits very easily onto the issue of corruption. Elites look after themselves, they corrupt the political process, you're the ones who suffer. So it's not a surprise that the far right talks about corrupt practices. In terms of what they would do to fight corruption, that's much more difficult to pin down. What they generally end up saying is give us power and we'll sort it out, which of course is not really an anti-corruption policy at all. Many of the things the AfD talks about are not detailed in terms of corruption. In fact, they don't use the word corruption actually as frequently as you might expect, but they do definitely use the German words for dissatisfaction and disdain and Verachtung for those who speak German. That's one of their key words. They think that the elites really have no respect for general people, so they plug in to a corruption discourse without being particularly explicit about what they do to put it right, other than vote for us and we will sort it out.
Right. In your work, you discuss the limitations of citizen-led anti-corruption efforts. How do populist parties frame corruption differently compared to traditional anti-corruption movements? How effective are citizen-centered approaches to anti-corruption in countering populist narratives that thrive on corruption scandals?
Yeah, well, the citizen-centered approaches are quite new, and they take very different forms in different parts of the world. In some places, they are there are websites like ipaidabribe.com in India, where you can report if you yourself have experienced bribery. Now, in countries like the United Kingdom or in Germany, that's not really that necessary. I've never had to pay a bribe in the United Kingdom. And it's not a part of the everyday fabric of life here. But of course, there's lots and lots of corruption. It just comes in a different form. So the type of citizen-led approach that you have will differ. For example, we have websites here in the United Kingdom where you can see how much politicians earn. how much they are given in donations down to the last pence, and you can make your own judgments then about whether that's appropriate or not, or whether that's corrupt or not. And that's because the state functions reasonably well in the United Kingdom. We can collect this data and make it publicly available, and then people can decide whether Boris Johnson getting millions and millions of pounds to go and give lecture tours is appropriate or not. So the citizen-led approaches differ a lot from place to place, depending on what the corruption problem is. They're successful when they're not isolated. You need an anti-corruption infrastructure. You need institutions to help take prosecutions forward. You need the rule of law to mean something, which of course in many places it doesn't. It's applied very patchily. So you need a whole set of institutions to make these citizen-led approaches count. Now that is all too difficult, really, for the far right. That's very focused. It's in many ways not dramatic enough for them. Their arguments will center around an elite, and they don't often tell you what that elite looks like, but an elite that looks after itself. And they will then use a big stick, often with the word corruption written on it, to hit that elite and to say that, these guys have disdain for you. If you vote for us, we will change that relationship. But the details of the change, that they're not very well panned out, they're not very well explained, and they don't really involve that much that I would understand as citizen-led approaches. They do talk about direct democracy a lot, but again, that fits in with the populist narrative of giving people power, and hopefully the people will then say what you want them to say. But in practice, not too many far-right parties get in a position where they can ever actually enact any of that stuff. So it remains quite vague, really.
Right. Populist leaders often portray themselves as fighters against a corrupt elite. However, many populist leaders claim to fight corruption while simultaneously dismantling institutional checks and balances. How do you assess the paradox of anti-corruption populism? Based on your research, do such narratives result in actual anti-corruption measures, or are they primarily rhetorical tools?
Well, they're not just rhetorical tools, they're practical tools. But they're not practical tools to fight corruption. They're practical tools to empower those who push them forward. So many of the what I would call backsliding mechanisms that we've seen populist regimes enact are not really about anything other than dismantling processes that they see as working against them. And they want to create new processes that don't work against them. And Viktor Orban is a great example of that in Hungary. They create what they would argue are institutions that work for the good of the people. People like me would argue, well, they also look like they work really well for you. And that's ultimately where they end up. So I wouldn't say this is about anti-corruption at all. This is about empowering those who push those narratives.
Right. Your research suggests that corruption can be a mobilizing grievance, but also that frequent exposure to it can lead to apathy. How does this paradox play out in the context of Germany and the rise of AfD? To what extent do mainstream parties' failures in tackling corruption contribute to the rise of far-right parties like AfD?
I don't think the corruption narrative is really that helpful in explaining the rise of the AfD. And it might be a bit odd for me to say that, given I work in a corruption research centre. But basically, for me anyway, the rise of the AfD is about other things. It's about dissatisfaction, it's about disaffection, it's about people being unhappy with their lot. And a lot of the time, the people are not being particularly reasonable. But at the same time, the AfD is very good at talking to their unhappinesses and talking to the fact that they're not at one with the way Germany works. Now, corruption in any meaningful sense is not really part of that. It is in a broad sense. The elites corrupt the process. They look after themselves. They don't look after you. But I don't think corruption in an everyday sense in Germany is a driving force there. I think there are better variables to look at to try and explain, the AfD's rise.
Right. One of your studies discusses how citizens' direct experiences with bribery influence their willingness to protest.
Yeah.
In Germany, where large-scale bribery is relatively rare, what factors do you think drive the populist anti-corruption discourse?
Yeah, bribery is really rare in Germany, as it is in the UK. But if you ask people if they think much of it exists, they'll tell you yes. And you often find people who will tell you, yeah, there's a lot of corruption in Germany. Oh, I've never experienced it, but there's a lot of corruption. So there's a paradox here between what they experience and what they perceive. And the paradox can be really significant and really, really obvious when you talk to individuals about it. I don't think in any meaningful sense, corruption is a big theme in German politics. There are simply too many other bigger themes that have crashed in at the moment, whether it be Ukraine, whether it be the climate crisis, whether it be the ineffectual government that Germany's just got rid of. And the anti-corruption narratives they're really for people who know the subject. They're really for those who are geeks, people like me, who are interested in the detail. And I don't think many Germans are losing sleep at night over corruption challenges. It's not the way they frame the problems that they experience, which is ironic because Germany, like many other states, has corruption problems that are there. It's just you don't see them every day. Contracts are awarded to companies that perhaps shouldn't be awarded to them, but people don't know about that. People don't read all of the detail of page 17 of a heavyweight newspaper to find it out. So that sort of corruption is a bit beyond them. And I totally understand why. They have their own lives to lead, right? So I think the anti-corruption narrative in Germany is rather stilted. It's not got the same sort of dynamic that it might have in other places because of the many other things that people are more concerned about.
Right. In recent elections, the AfD nearly doubled its support. Unlike in some Southern and Eastern European context, Germany has relatively robust anti-corruption institutions. Why do you think the AfD still manages to frame corruption as a central issue?
Well, I'm not sure it does. It talks about corruption, but what it's really doing is finding a way of explaining that your problems, your worries, your concerns, those guys over there in Berlin, they don't care. And so it frames it as one part of a much bigger narrative about the political process not working for you. And that's dangerous because, of course, if that political process isn't working, they may suggest alternatives that look a bit more like Orban. And that's not going to be in Germany's interest to go down that route. It's worth remembering 70% of people in Germany last week said they would never, under any circumstances, consider voting for the AfD. So sure, it got 20% of the vote. Many people like me are very disconcerted by that. But it's worth keeping the context here. There are the majority of German people have no time for the AfD and don't buy the snake oil that they try and sell.
Mainstream parties often struggle with countering populist claims about corruption. Based on your work, what strategies should democratic institutions adopt to maintain trust while effectively combating corruption?
Well, getting corruption right takes time and it takes patience. It took Britain about 300 years to go from being really very corrupt to being a bit less corrupt. It took Denmark and Sweden, who both had what in the literature is called a Big Bang approach. It took them 15 years to bring in the Big Bang when they changed all of their institutions in the 19th century. It's 15 years. That's 3 electoral cycles. And of course, once they brought in this new institutional framework, it didn't work perfectly immediately. It's now, 100 years later, that we see Denmark and Sweden as real forerunners in this area. So if you want quick solutions, you're going to struggle because it takes a lot of time to change processes. In truth, the best anti-corruption policy is to govern well. Give people a little bit more of what they want in terms of getting a little bit richer, a little bit safer, a little bit more secure, feel that they're listened to. That takes time, but that's the best anti-corruption method. You could bring in a new anti-corruption commission. You can bring in new anti-corruption laws, and you might snare some people with that. But for normal people on the streets, better governance is the way ahead. And that takes time. And that's something I hope that Friedrich Merz is aware of. He's not going to solve these problems in a month.
Is there empirical evidence showing that stronger anti-corruption policies lead to a decline in support for populist parties? Or do such policies risk being weaponized by populists themselves?
Oh, they certainly can be. Poland's a really good example. In 2006, a strong anti-corruption commission was brought in, and the populist government just used it to go after its enemies. And the irony of that was that its enemies had hardly been in power at all, and yet they were the ones apparently who'd been abusing their positions, in government, which was like surreal because many of them have not been in government. So there's a real danger that anti-corruption institutions can be hijacked, and we see that all around the world. Now, Germany's not really in that position. If you ask Germans what their anti-corruption institutions were, I'm not sure many of them would know. But certainly there is a danger that populists can use these new institutions to serve their own ends. And the best example is Donald Trump. You know, he uses these institutions to serve his own ends. So that's why democracy is not about one particular institution. It's about a network. It's about a mosaic of institutions that work together, that can constrain each other at times, but also support each other. And it's getting that mosaic right that's the real challenge, because then it's difficult for populists to, you know, to really unpack it all. And ultimately, they find it, you know, they find it harder then to get their agenda through.
Right. With rising political fragmentation in Germany, do you think anti-corruption efforts will become more partisan? And if so, what are the risks of this for democratic accountability?
Well, partisanship's always an issue, right? And in many ways, I don't have a problem with that. You know, parties represent interests, they represent people, and they try and get those interests into the political process. Corruption is no different to that. But I don't see anti-corruption being a particularly salient issue in German politics over the next legislative cycle at all. There'll be things that are linked into potentially corrupt practice, but a much more of it will centre on money. Where do we find the money to invest in our infrastructure? Where do we find the money to support Ukraine? Where do we find the money to to do all the other things that we want to do, the climate revolution, the Energiewende, so that, you know, move to more sustainable energies. All of this actually centers around the daily sort of politics that we're used to, about money, about influence, about interests. The corruption narrative is not in the middle of that, and I can't see the next government having any real time to devote to it either, which may be good, may be bad, but given the nature of Germany's financial challenges, I think it's inevitable.
Looking ahead, do you see that AfD's anti-corruption narrative evolving further? And if so, how might this impact broader European trends in populism and governance?
It may evolve further, but they like using the word corruption because it's an old. People generally think they know what corruption is, although I would disagree sometimes with people's understandings of it. But I think they will use the corruption narrative whenever they can, because it helps them point the finger at the government. It helps them, you know, gain political attention. Whether that will have any meaningful effect, I don't know. I mean, the parties of the populist right have always talked about corruption, and I'm not sure they've always really benefited from that. It's been one small part of their tool. And it's the same in Austria. And Austria is a really good example for Germans to look at. The government there, or the FPO there, has been successful because it's highlighted Austrian dissatisfaction with the mainstream parties. That's what it's done. It's given them a vehicle to try and say, no, we don't like that, even if they're not very good at explaining what that actually is. And that's where the AfD's strengths lie, in being a vehicle for protest, a vehicle for dissatisfaction. And that is the real lesson, that they're very good at that. And they've used social media effectively to do that. And they talk to a generation that the mainstream politicians are struggling to reach.
Despite ongoing controversies, including investigations into AfD figures for extremism, the party continues to attract voters, as evidenced by Sunday's election results. To what extent has the AfD succeeded in mainstreaming far-right discourse in German politics, and what implications does this have for broader political landscape?
Yeah, and the one thing they have done is change the way Germans talk about migration. German politicians really didn't want to talk about migration until about 15 years ago. It was just an issue they all agreed that they would deal with in a very sober, a very technical way. But that, of course, changed probably 20 years ago, really, but absolutely, definitely in 2015, when over 1 million asylum seekers arrived in Germany from North Africa and the Middle East. So the AfD has been very good at getting language into public discourse that wasn't there before. And this is a real challenge for all mainstream parties. They definitely find themselves engaging in debates that they haven't had to engage in the past. Euroscepticism is another area, you know, criticism of the EU. In Germany, that wasn't really a thing until relatively recently. And now it is. And the AfD's played a role in that. It's not the only reason that that's happened, but it's played a role in that. And that's a challenge. They've got to find a language that can talk to the problems the AfD highlights, but help solve them If they can't do that, then the AfD are the winners. That they will continue to be able to point to government inadequacies in dealing with the problems in the way that they frame them.
Right. And lastly, with the AfD's rise, are we seeing an erosion of public trust in Germany's democratic institutions, or is this simply a reflection of broader European trends in far-right politics?
Well, it can be both. I mean, Germany's now become a bit more normal. Most countries have a far-right party that's around 20%. This is nothing new in France. Holland has had real challenges with this as well, with Geert Wilders. Most countries have got far-right parties that do what the AfD does, and in some of them, they've had them for a long, long time. So in that sense, it's just a return to normality there. But of course, Germany has a unique history, and Germans are not very happy. Most Germans not very happy with that return to normality. I think moving forward, the AfD is in a position where it can expand on where it is. And the next election in 4 years' time, it's highly unlikely that the AfD will be anywhere near government before then, which means they'll be able to continue complaining. They'll be able to continue moaning. And if the German government has not made progress in solving, or at least looking like it's trying to solve some of the big issues of the day, then the AfD may do better again. And that's the real challenge. Okay. Of course, it's not just on the far right. Die Linke had a very good election on the populist left. And there's another party, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, just missed out on getting into parliament. So there's 13% or so on the left as well that's broadly speaking populist. There's a lot of populism about. And the only way to deal with that is to govern sensibly and to produce things that make people a little bit happier with their lives. Just telling them they're anti-democrats, for example, that ain't going to work. That ain't going to work. You're just going to offend them and insult them, and they're actually more likely to vote against you in the future. And that's not too difficult to understand, I would have thought. If someone insults me, then I'm hardly like to say, you know what, you're right. It doesn't work like that. Human nature is different. So I think the discourse has to be clever and the results have to be meaningful. If that's the case, then the AfD's rise doesn't have to be unstoppable.
Professor Hough, thank you so very much for your time.
My pleasure.